So, the term collective trauma refers to the psychological reactions to a traumatic event that affects an entire society. In the video, they refer to the definition of collective trauma as a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of community. Now, according to the National Library of Medicine, it suggests that the tragedy is represented in the collective memory of the group. And like all forms of memory, it comprises not only a reproduction of events, but also an ongoing reconstruction of the trauma in an attempt to make sense of it. So in response to the video on stages of disaster, it brought back a memory of my own. I remember watching news videos about Hurricane Katrina, and I remember that the storm kept moving categories. So at first it was a category 2, and then it became a category 3, and then ultimately it was this category 5 storm. And I remember watching this news clip of the aftermath. I was only in middle school and I had never seen anything like this before. But I do remember an increase in the number of students enrolling from Louisiana into my school. And although I was not a resident of Louisiana, all of the news acknowledgement and the relief efforts helped me to understand that this wasn't just a storm. This was actually a tragedy. So for someone who just went through a disaster or a tragedy, I would tell them to envision a densely woven cloth symbolizing the ties that bind people in the community. Every thread symbolizes the connection of feeling, of acceptance, and a common comprehension of what it means to be a member of that group. And it's like taking a blow to this fabric. You know, the sense of togetherness is severely broken. The threads are pulled apart and the relationship between people are severed. So this means that people may feel alienated from one another despite sharing comparable experiences. Individuals may experience a breakdown in communication, a loss of trust, and a sense of isolation as they struggle to cope with the disaster consequences. The prevailing sense of community, which was previously robust and tough, has now deteriorated and became fragile. So, after such a hard hit, the community needs time, energy, assistance to rebuild. It's about uniting, repairing the shattered ties, and strengthening the ties that bind everyone, and it entails for the caring of the psychological and the emotional wounds caused by the disaster. So, stress following a tragedy can have a significant negative impact on one's mental health. And it can show up in a number of ways, including post-traumatic stress disorder, that's PTSD. A lot of people who experience a disaster can develop PTSD. And this is characterized by memories, nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety. There may also be panic attacks, depression, survivor's guilt. When one person survives a disaster and another does not, they may feel deeply guilty and wonder why they were spared when others were not. There's emotional pain and a sense of worthlessness, and self-blame may result from this. People may also experience sleep disorders, substance abuse, and loss of identity and meaning, and also an increased stress and tension of relationships. The recovery process has a number of stages. So in the video, we learned of 6 phases. The first phase is the pre-disaster phase. This is a time when most people aren't thinking of the disaster or planning for it. There may be a sense of complacency, and the reality of the disaster happening doesn't really exist. With Hurricane Katrina, we should all consider the cost of evacuation, the time sitting in the car, and then the cost of a hotel room. And most people didn't have these resources to leave, which kind of forced them to stay and witness the next phase. The second phase is the disaster phase. Now, this is when the actual storm occurs or the terrorist strikes. This phase could be short-lived to a few minutes, maybe hours, but with Hurricane Katrina, this phase was prolonged to months and years. And there's a growing sense that life might not ever be the same. Now, after the huge outpour of this destruction, of this tragedy, we move on to the third phase, which is the heroic phase. Now, this phase is characterized by extraordinary support efforts when the country or even the world may be focused on this specific area to give money, time, energy, and resources. There's a lot of media attention that come with this phase, along with government efforts, bringing in hope to the community. In terms of the video with Hurricane Katrina, the initial heroic phase at first looked like helicopters rescuing people from their roofs or neighbors coming in with their boats to rescue others. But this phase could be ongoing depending on the magnitude of destruction, and it could overlap into the next phase. So after the heroic outpouring, people actually start being encouraged. And we move into the next phase, which is known as the honeymoon phase. And there's money and help coming in for relief. So people start to pick up a sense that things will be okay. We may often hear heartwarming stories during this phase when people are reunited with loved ones, or when they go back home and find small artifacts of things they thought they would never find. Now, that phase is usually then followed by something that we call the disillusionment phase. Now, during this phase, the true impact of what has happened starts to settle in with the community and the understanding of the magnitude of the situation. They may be thinking this is too much or too difficult or costs more money and more time than we had even realized. This is when fear or harsh reality actually sets in, and there's a decrease in the number of contributions. The outpouring slowly tapers off, and then certain disaster organizations may leave at this point. News media also begins to focus on other stories. So there's an awareness that sets in and a fatigue upon the community. In the video, they mentioned an increase in suicide attempts. So there's an understanding that life won't ever be the same at this point. Now, the final stage that we discussed in the video is the reconstruction phase. This is the phase when people pick themselves up and start to feel the new normal. And it usually gives people the opportunity to start over and to do things better. This is when people see the actual rebuilding and the livelihood coming back into the community. Now, as a counselor, you may be needed throughout this person's entire recovery process. In the fundamentals of crisis counseling, I learned that in the initial stages of a recovery, a counselor can offer acute support. The goal is to reduce the distress of the client and increase the client's understanding of his or her reactions. We want to reduce the negative coping and increase the client's knowledge of when additional resources may be needed and how they can access those resources. Psychological first aid is included in this stage as well. Next, the person may need intermediate support from the counselor. The therapeutic relationship is critical in this stage of counseling, and the focus is on assisting the client in coping with the daily stressors. Now, experience from this disaster in this stage, the visits or interventions usually are 3 to 5 visits. And the techniques included are psychoeducational, informative, cognitive behavioral approaches, and anxiety management. And ultimately, this person may need ongoing treatment. Now, during this stage, the treatment of the interventions are tailored to the specific client and their issues. Now, all things considered, a tragedy can have a lasting and complex effect on mental health, and necessitating extensive assistance and intervention to foster recovery and resilience in the wake of the disaster. People must seek professional assistance if they are experiencing difficulties with their mental health. Thank you.